It's a strategy that a lot of companies utilize. I guess to me, I would think about more about how your buckets are. When I was kind of talking about your buckets of money, I would think of that as more of, my husband and I kind of have a bucket that we call, my husband also works in the industry, so we both have very strong opinions and like to express our opinions on the market in what we call almost what we call our fun money bucket, meaning that it's okay if it goes to zero. As well as you should have an opinion on what the stock is itself, and I would be making sure that you're not using money that could be in your 401k as such. Like I would think of it that way. I think for me to give you a really great answer, I'd have to know your personal assets itself. But to me, that's more of like when you're starting to invest in single name, you need to think about the concentrations of your portfolio. You need to think about what your view is on the stock. You need to think about what we call like worst case scenario is, like what is the risk that's associated with that stock and so forth.
One really important thing to consider also with this is how liquid is the stock. Yes. So if you're going to work for, say, an ExxonMobil where it's publicly traded and you can easily liquidate that stock and get your money out of it, that's one thing, right? You know, there's some amount of security in that purchase. But if you're going to go work for a startup and it's not a publicly traded stock, there's no foreseeable future for an IPO or anything like that, that money's locked in there, and it's really, really hard to get it out. Really, really, really hard to get it out. I want to make sure that is crystal clear. Yeah, exactly. I owned a very closely held company, right? Very illiquid asset, and it's really hard to go through that process to find a buyer to get that stock out. Oftentimes, if you're buying into a small company or a closely held company that's not publicly traded, there might also be rules on how you can sell that stock. So, do you need to offer it back to the company first at the same price that you purchased it at? Or what's the new value of that stock? Oftentimes, small companies, closely held companies is probably a better way of describing it. Closely held companies can define how they value their stock. And one day it might be very advantageous and it might be showing a great trend upwards. But the next day they might just say, yeah, our stock's worth, a penny, and basically tank the price, and you have no control over that whatsoever. So something to be very, very cautious of, especially depending on the type of company that you're working for. Publicly traded companies, there's probably some amount of security in that purchase. Smaller companies, closely held companies, buyer beware.
And one thing to be careful about there too is when you typically have an employee discount program for the stock, usually that's through a payroll deduction. So it's sort of out of sight, out of mind. You're deducting it and you're accumulating it, and all of a sudden you do get a pretty heavy concentration in that. You may not realize it because it's just, it's out of sight, out of mind, as I said. So you really have to be careful of that.
I guess a related topic, some companies will give what they call restricted stock or stock options as part of their compensation program, especially as a bonus or as an incentive for you to work harder. Those are not the things that you actually have any decision about. You take them, your decision is when to sell them, essentially. The restricted stock, for example, in my company, I could sell half of it after 3 years, I could sell the other half after 7 years. And that's a way of incentivizing employees to, as I say, work harder and stick around. Because if you leave the company, a lot of times they take the restricted stock back.
Yes, the question is clarification on a 401k versus an IRA.
Sure, so they're both tax deferred accounts. 401k is generally sponsored by your employer. Another phrase would be like a 403b. You mentioned a SEP. There's lots of different employer-sponsored retirement accounts, whereas the IRA is sponsored by the government, and it really depends upon where what your tax rate is and what your salary is about how much you can actually pay if it's deducted and so forth. So I can't give you precise information because I obviously don't know your salary, but a lot of times it can be a deductible investment into your IRA. But regardless, they both grow tax deferred. which is a huge advantage and should be taken of heavily. Underline that 7 times.
Does everyone know what tax deferred means? Okay. This is something that it took me a really long time to understand. So, tax deferred basically means you're not being, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I might not fully understand it yet, but basically means that you're not being taxed on that money now. You're going to be taxed on it when you pull it out of that investment in the future. So, theoretically, you're going to be at a different tax bracket in the future, and it's more advantageous to pull it out then than it is now. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, as well as the fact that it means that when you are potentially getting dividends, I would say dividends is a great example within your 401k or your IRA, and you choose to reinvest them, you're not basically paying taxes on that, and so that money is growing faster, because you can imagine you're continuing to put more and more money into those investments, and that's how you get the types of returns that that you had mentioned.
Yeah, there's 2 benefits, as we said. As an example, let's say you make $100,000 a year. You put $10,000 into your 401k. Instead of paying income tax on $100,000, you only pay income tax on $90,000, because you don't pay tax on that $10,000 that you put in your IRA, and you also don't pay tax on whatever growth occurs within your IRA until you retire and start taking that money out. I just retired on Friday, so I'm in a position where, thank you, yeah, 41 years. So I'm now in the position where I'm going to have to start taking that money out of my IRA that I've been putting in all these years, and every dollar I take out is going to count as income that I will have to pay income tax on. It's like the old commercial, you pay me now, you can pay me later. But at least while that money was in the 401k, it could generate income, generate dividends, and I can move from one asset to another without having to pay tax every time I made a move.
So the question is whether or not you can open an IRA regardless of being in a company.
Sure. I forget the exact age, but I think it's like 18 or 19, and you need to have income. So yes, if you have income, and then yes, you can open an IRA. You could just go to your local bank, or I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say there's a limit. You can only put something like $5,500 into the IRA per year, and if you make over a certain amount of money, you lose the tax deduction when it's going in. You can still put it in there and let it grow tax-free, but I think that rate is.
Yeah, I mean, on a stipend, my guesstimate is that you are way below the salary limits. You can go online and literally, like Fidelity.com could tell you what the salary limits are. But yes, the $5,500 is the total amount that you are able to place into your IRA each year, and depending upon what your salary is, can be tax deductible. So it's a huge advantage if you're if you have that additional expendable income.
Whereas a 401k, you can put I think it's $18,500 per year into the 401k, and if you're 50, you can add additional catch-up contributions, which I think are another $5,000 or $5,500 on top of that.
It's around that,
Yeah.
The numbers change every
Yeah.
every year
Yeah. They keep changing them just to make it interesting.
to keep me employed.